18 names were leaked in one night, but the name that haunted everyone had already been gone for 4 months. The year had barely begun when the entertainment world fractured under the weight of a single leak. A list. 18 names. All first-tier celebrities. All allegedly burdened with massive unpaid tax debts. Within hours, the internet descended into chaos. Fans argued. Reputations trembled. Loyalty collapsed in real time. Then came the reassurance. An influencer claimed every debt had already been settled. The damage, however, had already spread. What followed was not relief, but something far more corrosive. Disbelief, disillusionment, a collective sense of betrayal. For many, this was not just another scandal. It was proof that the industry they admired was rotting from the inside. While public attention fixated on rumors and denials, another voice resurfaced. Calm, blunt, unafraid. A critic known for cruelty rather than compassion spoke up. Instead of naming the living, he invoked the dead. A man absent for nearly 4 months. Yu Menglong. It was an unexpected turn. Yu Menglong had not been part of the leaked list. He had not been accused. He had not defended himself. According to official records, he no longer could. His death had already been categorized. Accidental, alcohol-related, closed. And yet, the moment his name re-entered the conversation, something shifted. Because unlike the others, no scandal followed him. No secret recordings emerged. No buried accusations surfaced. The deeper people searched, the more unsettling the absence became. In an industry often described as a contaminated swamp, Yu Menglong appeared almost anomalous, unremarkable in wealth, unimpressive in power, impossibly clean. That contradiction did not bring comfort. It raised suspicion. In environments built on excess, silence is rarely accidental. It is engineered, managed, enforced, and Yu Menglong's silence felt too complete, too efficient, too final. As conversations about him reappeared online, they vanished just as quickly. Posts were removed, images altered, entire threads dissolved without explanation. What remained was a growing unease, not outrage, not hysteria, something colder, more disciplined, the sense that forgetting was being requested, perhaps even demanded. People did not comply. Instead, they adapted. Names were changed, networks renamed, messages hidden in plain sight. Ordinary citizens began turning memory into resistance. No banners, no march, just quiet refusal. At this point, the question was no longer whether Yu Menglong had been innocent. The question was why innocence seemed to require erasure. Because when corruption becomes routine, integrity is no longer admired. It is treated as an anomaly, a disruption, a risk. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can be is not powerful, or outspoken, or rebellious. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is being uncorrupted. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is being uncorrupted. The leak did not simply expose individuals. It exposed a pattern. As names circulated and agencies rushed to deny responsibility, a deeper conversation began to surface. Not about taxes, not about personal morality, but about the invisible framework that allowed such scandals to exist without consequence. An ecosystem where protection was selective and silence was currency. Within this framework, power did not operate openly. It moved through private rooms, late nights, and unspoken expectations. According to multiple accounts echoed across the industry, success was rarely determined by talent alone. It was negotiated, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, always asymmetrically. A well-known critic, infamous for his merciless assessments, described this world without ornamentation. He claimed that many male celebrities lived double lives, publicly polished, privately reckless. Nightclubs replaced rehearsal rooms. Alcohol replaced discipline. Gambling replaced restraint. Women were not partners but accessories. This was not presented as rumor, but as routine. For audiences, such statements landed like blunt force trauma. They contradicted the carefully curated images that had been sold for years. The smiling interviews, the charitable gestures, the illusion of virtue. What emerged instead was the suggestion of an industry sustained by indulgence and protected by collective denial. The critic went further. He warned families from ordinary backgrounds to keep their children away from this world entirely. Not because fame was dangerous, but because refusal was. According to him, those unwilling to adapt to the unspoken rules were not merely sidelined. They were targeted, marginalized, erased. This idea was not new. It simply rarely surfaced so plainly. Former insiders, speaking cautiously, described an environment where invitations were obligations, dinners that were not optional, drinks that could not be refused, relationships framed as opportunities rather than coercion. Declining was interpreted not as professionalism, but as defiance. And defiance carried a price. In this system, those who complied advanced quickly. Roles multiplied. Exposure increased. Resources flowed. Those who resisted found their careers inexplicably stalled. Payments delayed. Contracts dissolved. Invitations stopped arriving. The industry did not punish loudly. It simply withdrew oxygen. What made this structure so effective was its plausibility. No single action appeared criminal. No single actor seemed responsible. Everything could be explained away as business decisions, market forces, creative differences. Yet when examined collectively, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Silence, in this world, was not passive. It was cultivated. Public outrage flared occasionally, then faded. Scandals broke, then resolved themselves without resolution. Statements were issued. Apologies drafted. The cycle repeated. Each time, the system survived intact, adapted, hardened. Within this context, the death of Yu Menglong began to look less isolated, because in a culture where compromise was normalized, a person who refused to compromise stood out immediately, not as a hero, but as an anomaly. He did not attend the right gatherings. He did not network in the expected ways. He did not exchange proximity for progress. Accounts suggest that he declined situations others accepted as inevitable, not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. And quiet refusal is the most disruptive form of resistance. Those who benefit from opaque systems rely on predictability, on compliance disguised as ambition, on the assumption that everyone can be persuaded. When that assumption fails, the response is rarely confrontation. It is exclusion. The industry does not attack directly. It waits. The critic summarized it with chilling simplicity. In his words, corruption was no longer an exception. It was the baseline. And once corruption becomes standard, integrity ceases to be admirable. It becomes suspicious, dangerous, because integrity cannot be controlled. It does not negotiate. It does not bargain. It does not owe anyone favors. And in an environment sustained by leverage, something that cannot be leveraged becomes a threat. Yu Menglong existed within this system without participating in it. He moved through it without absorbing its logic. For years, that resistance appeared to cost him everything. Yet it also left him untouched by the stains that marked others. As the critic observed, in a world built on compromise, those who refuse to bend do not rise. They vanish. Not all at once, gradually, quietly, cleanly. And this realization reframed everything. The scandals, the denials, the silence. They were no longer isolated incidents. They were symptoms. Because in an industry built on compromise, integrity becomes a liability. Measured against the standards of the industry, Yu Menglong never appeared successful. He did not command record-breaking contracts. He did not dominate headlines. He did not surround himself with luxury or spectacle. For years, his presence remained quiet, almost invisible, despite a career that should have placed him far higher on the ladder of recognition. What gradually emerged, however, was a different kind of profile, one that did not fit the logic of advancement. According to individuals familiar with his circumstances, Yu Menglong lived with striking restraint. Despite years of work, his financial situation remained fragile. In a city where visibility often equates to survival, he spent more than a decade living in the same rented apartment. 12 years. No upgrades, no symbols of arrival, no outward proof of belonging. This was not due to a lack of opportunity. It was the result of repeated marginalization. Accounts suggest that his agency considered him difficult, not unprofessional, not unreliable, difficult in a quieter way. He did not comply with arrangements that were never put in writing. He did not accept invitations whose purpose extended beyond social courtesy. He did not understand why access should require submission. For this, he paid a consistent price. Payments were delayed. some reportedly withheld altogether. Roles passed to others with less experience but greater flexibility. His name was present, but never prioritized. He existed within the system, but remained peripheral to its rewards. Yet even as his own life remained constrained, his attention turned outward. Archived footage and photographs resurfaced after his death, not as part of a publicity campaign, but as fragments of a record no one had bothered to assemble before. In 2014, Yu Menglong participated in the Ice Bucket Challenge to raise awareness for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. No announcement, no amplification, just participation. Other images showed him attending fundraising events for leukemia patients, sitting quietly among families, listening more than speaking, giving without spectacle. These gestures were not consistent with strategic branding. They were inconsistent with ambition, as it is commonly understood in entertainment. They offered no measurable return, and that was precisely what made them unsettling. Fans began to re-examine his past through this new lens. What they found was not martyrdom. It was modesty taken to an extreme. He spent little on himself. He saved where he could. He declined indulgence. Some described him as frugal, others as self-denying, but nearly all agreed on one point. When it came to others, he was generous to the point of discomfort. One piece of fan-made animation captured this contradiction with devastating clarity. It depicted supporters holding a small injured fish, crying openly as they tried to protect it. The symbolism was unambiguous. Fragile, wounded, still alive, still giving. The more these fragments surfaced, the more difficult it became to reconcile them with the narrative of a reckless life. Nothing about Yu Menglong suggested excess. There were no images of intoxication, no reports of nightlife, no stories of entitlement. Instead, there was an accumulation of restraint. This absence of darkness did not inspire relief. It inspired grief. Because in a system accustomed to discovering corruption eventually, the inability to locate it felt wrong, almost suspicious, as if goodness itself were an unresolved anomaly. Supporters began asking a question that would not go away. If he had lived so carefully, why did his life end so abruptly? And why was the explanation so thin? Yu Menglong did not conform to the industry's expectations, but he also did not confront them openly. He did not expose. He did not accuse. He simply refused to become what the system required. In doing so, he positioned himself outside the transactional logic that governed success. He became someone who could not be leveraged, not through desire, not through fear, not through reward. That kind of person does not fit. And in environments built on silent agreements, those who refuse to sign without speaking often disappear without explanation. He followed every rule that mattered. He violated none that were written. He worked. He gave. He endured. And that may have been the problem. He did everything right. And that may have been the problem. According to official statements, there was nothing mysterious about Yu Menglong's death. The report was brief, clinical, final, alcohol-related, an accident. No signs of criminal involvement. No further investigation required. The case, it appeared, had closed itself. On paper, everything made sense. Yet almost immediately, doubt began to circulate. Not because of what the authorities said, but because of what followed. Or, rather, what disappeared. Discussions online did not escalate. They evaporated. Posts questioning the circumstances were removed within hours. Images associated with Yu Menglong were altered, blurred, or quietly replaced. Search results shifted. What had been visible one day became inaccessible the next. This was not the chaos of misinformation. It was the orderliness of containment. People noticed the speed, the coordination, the lack of explanation. And with each deletion, suspicion hardened into resolve. Not outrage, not panic, determination. If his death was truly accidental, many asked, why did it require such aggressive erasure? As days passed, the response from the public evolved. Without calls for protest or confrontation, individuals began finding ways to preserve his presence indirectly. Wireless networks were renamed, short messages embedded in plain sight, simple phrases that carried weight only to those looking closely. In residential neighborhoods, apartment doors displayed his image. In commercial spaces, his face appeared briefly on electronic screens before vanishing again. Videos surfaced showing large public displays lighting up with his likeness, only to be censored shortly after. Locations were intentionally obscured, identities protected. Support moved quietly, but persistently. This was not activism in the traditional sense. It was remembrance as resistance. Letters were written, not once, not twice, repeatedly, some addressed to officials, others left intentionally unsent, shared instead among strangers who understood the risk of visibility. These individuals became known online by a simple term: pigeons, messengers who refused to stop carrying memory, no matter how long it took. One image circulated widely before being removed. A car entirely covered in quotations attributed to Yu Menglong. Among them, 2 lines stood out. "Born human, live toward the light. I only want to go home and be with my mother." These words did not accuse. They did not demand. They mourned. And mourning, it seemed, was precisely what could not be tolerated. As suppression intensified, so did creativity. If images were forbidden, people turned to text. If text was removed, they turned to implication. One user summarized the sentiment with stark precision. "If writing is also forbidden, then here are 27 words. Delete them if you can." The point was not provocation. It was endurance. What emerged from this quiet defiance was a collective realization. This was no longer about a single individual. It was about the right to remember without permission, to question without being labeled disruptive, to grieve without being silenced. In this context, Yu Menglong's death ceased to be an isolated event. It became symbolic, a focal point for broader anxieties about power, control, and the fragility of truth in closed systems. The authorities did not respond publicly to these acts. They did not need to. The absence of engagement was itself a message. Finality was being enforced, not argued. But finality requires acceptance. And acceptance never came, because the more his memory was suppressed, the more it spread. Not as rumor, but as absence. A gap that could not be filled with explanations. A silence that spoke louder than denial. People were not asking for certainty. They were asking for time, for transparency, for the dignity of unresolved questions. In industries built on narrative control, unresolved questions are dangerous. They invite scrutiny. They fracture confidence. They linger. And Yu Menglong's death lingered. Not because evidence demanded it, but because the response to it did. They could remove his image. They could distort his story. They could insist the case was closed. But there was one thing they could not control. Memory does not require authorization. It only requires breath. They could erase his image, but they could not erase his absence. There are deaths that end with answers, and there are deaths that end with instructions. Yu Menglong's death was presented as the former. A closed case, a technical explanation, a conclusion delivered swiftly and without hesitation. Yet everything that followed suggested something else entirely. Not a mystery demanding resolution, but a silence demanding obedience. What unsettled people was not the lack of evidence. It was the lack of patience, the speed with which remembrance became inconvenient, the urgency with which questions were discouraged. In healthy systems, truth is tested through time. Here, time itself appeared restricted. This is why the story did not fade. Not because Yu Menglong was famous, not because he was flawless, but because he represented something increasingly rare. A person who moved through a corrupt environment without absorbing its logic. A life that produced no leverage, no compromat, no hidden transactions to expose after the fact. In systems sustained by exchange, such individuals are destabilizing. They cannot be threatened with exposure. They cannot be rewarded into silence. They cannot be bargained with. They can only be removed from the narrative. What followed his death revealed a deeper anxiety, not about one man, but about precedent. About what happens if refusal becomes visible, if restraint is acknowledged, if the public begins to admire those who do not adapt. That is why memory became the battlefield. The response from ordinary people was never about overthrowing authority. It was about resisting erasure, renaming a wireless network, displaying an image briefly, writing a sentence that could disappear at any moment. These acts were small by design. They did not demand attention. They demanded endurance. This quiet persistence exposed a simple truth. Forgetting is rarely natural. It is taught, enforced, rehearsed, and yet, forgetting requires cooperation. Yu Menglong's supporters did not seek certainty. They did not insist on a single narrative. They asked only for the right to doubt, to mourn, to remember without permission. In doing so, they transformed a personal loss into a moral question. What kind of world punishes restraint? What kind of industry survives by rewarding compromise and eliminating those who refuse it? And what does it say about us if we accept explanations simply because they arrive quickly? This story does not end with proof. It ends with tension, because unresolved questions do not disappear. They wait. They linger in the background of every polished image and every rehearsed apology. They remind us that truth does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it only reveals where silence has been forced. Yu Menglong may never receive the answers people seek. His case may remain officially closed, but closure imposed is not the same as closure earned. As long as people remember his name, this story is not over. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. If kindness can be punished, what kind of world are we being asked to accept?